Why can't the European Union leave the Sahel alone? They've called it the poorest region on earth. They've warned that it's too dangerous, too unstable. And when the military took over Burkina Faso, they were the first to step back, cutting diplomatic ties, turning their backs. But now, they're back. Suddenly, EU representatives are flying into Ouagadougou, shaking hands, smiling for cameras, and meeting behind closed doors with Burkina Faso's Prime Minister. 3 days. That's how long they stayed. 3 intense days trying to patch things up. So the question is, why? What changed? Why is the European Union, after branding Burkina Faso a military dictatorship, now eager to deepen relations with that very same regime? Is it about peace, power, or something far more strategic? And perhaps the bigger question, will Burkina Faso play along, or will they remind the West that this is a new Africa, one that bows to no one? Let's unravel the story. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré seized power in Burkina Faso back in September 2022, the European Union wasted no time. Condemnation came swiftly, loud, public, and absolute. To them, it was another military takeover, another blow to democracy in the Sahel. And their response? Threats, warnings, promises to cut off aid if Burkina Faso didn't fall back in line. But Traoré wasn't fazed. He didn't beg. He didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled the plug. In one bold move, President Traoré cut off all security and military cooperation with the European Union. Just like that. And when a similar coup unfolded in Niger, and the new military leader followed Traoré's lead, that's when the alarm bells started ringing in Brussels. The EU suddenly realized they weren't just losing influence in one country, they were losing the entire region. Now, unlike France, the former colonial power humiliated time and time again by the bold decisions of Sahelian leaders, other EU nations chose a different path. Germany, for example, was quick to join the chorus of disapproval. When Traoré took power, Berlin froze diplomatic ties, demanding a transition to civilian rule as a condition for re-engagement. But time passed, and nothing changed. Burkina Faso stood firm. The threats? Ignored. The pressure? Shrugged off. And then it hit them. Traoré wasn't bluffing. The military wasn't backing down. So quietly and without fanfare, Germany sent an envoy, a handshake, a conversation, an attempt to resume the very ties they once severed. And Germany wasn't alone. Denmark followed, then Italy. One by one, European nations began retracing their steps, trying to reopen doors that they had so confidently slammed shut. But here's the question. Is it diplomacy or desperation? One by one, these nations came to a quiet realization. It wasn't Burkina Faso that needed them. It was they who needed Burkina Faso. And now, the European Union is catching up to that truth. On May 13th, 2025, after a quiet but symbolic 3-day visit, João Gomes Cravinho, the EU's special representative for the Sahel, stood before the press in Ouagadougou. His message was carefully worded, but the subtext was loud and clear. Over 200 billion CFA francs invested since 2021. That's the EU's footprint in Burkina Faso, one they're not ready to lose. Cravinho called it a partnership built on dialogue, a dialogue that never ends, a diplomatic phrase, but one that reveals the EU's growing urgency to stay in the game. During his stay, he met with key authorities. Behind closed doors, conversations were held, strategies discussed. And after 72 hours of meetings, he stepped out with a message. The meetings were very useful. Now we must continue the dialogue, a dialogue that never stops, as long as there are ideas and objectives from both sides. But here's the question the world is still asking. Is this truly about cooperation? Or is it a scramble to regain lost influence in a region that's no longer waiting for permission? To João Gomes Cravinho, the message was simple. Burkina Faso and the European Union, he said, share a common interest, a shared vision for what he called win-win cooperation. Standing before reporters, he chose his words carefully, like a man trying to rebuild a fragile bridge. There is convergence between us. The relationship must be rich, mutually beneficial. The EU should be seen as a friend in this kind of cooperation. But beneath the polite language was a clear subtext. The European Union is no longer in control. It's negotiating. Cravigno continued. This cooperation is not static. It adapts to the realities of the moment. In other words, Europe is adjusting to a new reality in the Sahel, one where they no longer dictate the terms. He ended his speech with a tone of hope, but also caution. There is always progress to be made. We're not there yet. We need to keep talking. When dialogue stops, the entire relationship suffers. And just like that, the message was sent, not just to Burkina Faso, but to the rest of Europe. The old playbook no longer works. The Sahel is writing its own future now. And if Europe wants a seat at the table, it must earn it. Now, let's be clear. No agreement was reached. Not yet, because the terms have changed. For decades, the European Union sat at the head of the table, dictating conditions, controlling aid, and defining what cooperation looked like. Why? Because past leaders in Burkina Faso let them. Corrupt, compromised, weak, but President Traoré, he's cut from a different cloth. He's made one thing crystal clear. Burkina Faso is no longer anyone's subordinate. It is a sovereign nation, and it demands to be treated as such. So if there is to be any partnership, it must be on equal terms. No more one-sided deals, no more quiet domination. And that's where the EU's final statement speaks volumes. Cravigno said, Burkina Faso must see the EU as a friend if there's to be cooperation. But here's the quiet truth behind those words. If the EU must ask to be seen as a friend, then they already know. They're not. And should that be surprising? Absolutely not. Not when the EU stood in silence while Burkina Faso faced instability. Not when it froze aid the moment a new leader chose sovereignty over subservience. What we're witnessing isn't just diplomacy, it's a struggle for relevance, a desperate attempt by Europe to regain influence in a region that's no longer playing by the old rules. For over 400 years, Africa's relationship with Europe has been branded as partnership. But what has it really brought? For Burkina Faso and so many others, exploitation, underdevelopment, and dependence. Because for centuries, the partnerships were never equal. They were built on the backs of weak leaders who bowed to foreign interests and sold sovereignty for scraps. But that era is ending. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the rules have changed. Burkina Faso is no longer begging for aid. It's no longer pleading for help. It is standing on its own terms. And if the European Union still wants a seat at the table, it has to start with one thing: respect. No more lectures, no more ultimatums, no more unequal deals. Traoré's message is clear. We are not your subjects, we are your equals. And that is revolutionary. But it leaves us with a burning question. Why is Europe so eager to rebuild ties now? Have they forgotten that Burkina Faso is ruled by a military government? Have they forgotten the ongoing war against insecurity? Or do they see something else, something shifting? Back home, European media still paint Africa in black and white, literally and figuratively. To the average citizen in Paris or Berlin, Africa is poverty, starving children, thatched roofs, dirt roads, war zones. The same recycled image, the same tired narrative. And always, in the middle of it, Europe, the savior, the generous benefactor sending aid to the helpless continent. But that picture is a lie, and Burkina Faso is proving it. Because today, Africa isn't waiting to be saved. It's rising to save itself, and the world is watching. Whenever a country like Burkina Faso dares to break the mold, dares to reject the script written in Brussels or Washington, the punishment is swift. Aid, suspended. Diplomatic ties, frozen. Sanctions, threatened. And yet, despite not returning to civilian rule, despite standing firm in its sovereignty, the European Union is now rushing to restore relations with Burkina Faso. So the question is, why? What does the EU stand to gain? Because let's be honest, this has never been about charity. The story told in European headlines makes it sound like the EU gives and Africa receives. But in reality, nothing Europe does in Africa is free. Behind every donation, every mission, every handshake, there's strategy, there's interest, because what matters most to the West has always been what lies beneath Africa's soil. Gold, uranium, oil, rare earth minerals, the very lifeblood of modern industry and the future of global power. But today, it's not just about resources. Africa's geopolitical relevance is rising fast. Its population is exploding, its confidence is growing, and the continent is no longer playing the role of the silent partner. By 2050, 1 in every 4 people on Earth will be African. 1 in every 3 young people in the world will be African. And that reality is shaking the foundations of global diplomacy. As Michael Tancham of the European Council on Foreign Relations put it, any country that doesn't have a constructive relationship with Africa is going to lose its relative position in the global economy. And that is what this is all about. The European Union isn't just trying to save a relationship, it's trying to save its future relevance in a world where Africa is no longer a pawn, but a power. And that's why, today, individual European nations and the European Union itself are in a quiet race, a scramble to deepen ties with Africa, because deep down, they know a truth they rarely admit. It was Africa, its cheap resources, its stolen labor, that fueled Europe's rise. Africa built Europe's empires. Africa powered its industrial revolution. Africa made modern Europe possible. Now the world stands on the edge of transformation again. And once more, all eyes turn to Africa. But this time, a question looms. Will Africa once again be used to build other civilizations, while its own people remain behind? Because one thing is certain, this is not the Africa of yesterday. Today's Africa is bold, assertive, ready. The old days of one-sided partnerships are fading fast. Europe, once Africa's first partner by virtue of colonization, now finds itself competing, no longer privileged, no longer guaranteed. Because now, Africa has options. China is here, Russia is here, Turkey, the Gulf states, and for the first time in modern history, Africa is choosing. No longer bound by guilt or history, no longer dependent on old allies who offer conditions instead of respect. Today's African leaders are forging a new path, one that doesn't revolve around former colonial masters, but around what's best for Africa. And Europe, if it wants to remain relevant, if it wants to stay in Africa's future, it must finally do what it never did in the past. Treat Africa as an equal, because the continent that once built the world is now ready to build its own. There's something that sets Africa's relationship with Europe apart from its ties with nations like Russia or China. And it's not just history, it's imbalance. For decades, Europe has spoken the language of partnership, equal partnership, mutual respect, shared growth. But the reality, it was never equal. Trade agreements, economic pacts, aid packages, all dressed up as cooperation. But beneath the surface, Europe always took more than it gave. Always. While Africa exported raw materials, Europe exported promises. And time after time, those promises were broken. Because whenever Europe wants something, be it resources, political loyalty, or strategic access, it follows the same script. Offer billions, promise development, paint visions of shared prosperity. But when the ink dries and the cameras go home, what's left? Far less than promised. This cycle of broken trust has not gone unnoticed. Today's African leaders, sharper, more united, have started asking the hard questions. Why are we always the ones giving the most and receiving the least? And that's why the door has opened to Russia, to China, to any nation willing to treat Africa not as a charity case, but as a partner. Because while Europe still clings to its old playbook of promises and pressure, Africa has moved on. It's no longer just about where the money comes from. It's about where respect comes from. And in the new world that's emerging, respect is non-negotiable. For years, African nations tolerated Europe's dominance. Even as they began forging new alliances with China, with Russia, they still kept one foot in the old house, still attended the summits, still signed the agreements, still gave Europe the benefit of the doubt. But then came 2020, and with it, the pandemic. And suddenly, everything changed. When COVID-19 spread across the globe, the world entered crisis mode. But while vaccines rolled out swiftly in Europe, North America, and Asia, Africa was left waiting for help, waiting for doses, waiting for justice. But what came instead was betrayal. Europe hoarded the vaccines, blocked exports, and when they finally sent some, many had already expired. And as if that wasn't enough, when African scientists stepped forward, prepared to develop their own vaccines, the response was staggering: rejection. The European Union, alongside the United Nations, refused to recognize or legitimize vaccines created by Africans, as if innovation was a privilege reserved for others, as if Africa had no right to save itself. It was a moment of clarity, and across the continent, leaders began to speak out. Cyril Ramaphosa, Paul Kagame, voices once diplomatic, now defiant. The message was simple: enough. Enough of the exploitation, enough of the paternalism, enough of the illusion of partnership. And as the frustration boiled over, something historic began to unfold. The first wave of coups struck: Mali, then Burkina Faso, then Guinea, and finally, Niger. Each one, a spark in a growing fire, not just political change, but a continental reckoning. The old world order was being rejected, not in press conferences or polite statements, but in action. Africa was no longer asking to be seen, it was demanding to be respected. And Europe? It had to make a choice: adapt to the new Africa, or be left behind. The wave of military coups didn't just shake African governments, it triggered a seismic shift in Africa's relationship with Europe. And no country felt that shock more than France. For decades, France saw itself as the gatekeeper of Francophone Africa, the guiding hand, the benefactor, the former colonizer, still clinging to influence. But something was changing, something irreversible. As the dust settled after each coup, one sentiment echoed louder and louder across the Sahel: rage. Rage against imperialism, rage against decades of exploitation, rage against France. And while Western media rushed to blame the military juntas, claiming they were spreading anti-French propaganda, the truth ran much deeper. This anger didn't come from generals, it came from the people, from farmers and teachers, from youth in the streets, from a generation tired of being trapped in France's shadow. And as African nations turned their backs on their former colonizer, they turned their faces toward new partners: Russia, Turkey, Iran, nations that offered military support, infrastructure, investment, without the moral lectures and conditional aid. And then there was China. For over a decade, China had been quietly investing, building roads, ports, hospitals. Now the spotlight was finally on Beijing's bold bet that Africa didn't need Europe to rise. Suddenly, Europe began to realize the unthinkable. They were losing Africa, and in a scramble to regain lost ground, they did what desperate powers do. They called a summit. The Europe-Africa Summit of 2022, postponed twice, canceled before, now resurrected in panic. A last-ditch effort to mend a relationship that had already fractured. But the question remained: was it too late? Because the Africa sitting at the table in 2022 wasn't the same Africa Europe once thought it controlled. According to Lidet Tadessa Shifarov, Associate Director at the European Center for Development Policy Management, Europe was far more excited about the 2022 summit than Africa. European leaders poured into the summit halls with grand words and polished promises. Charles Michel, President of the European Council, called it the beginning of a new alliance between Africa and Europe. Emmanuel Macron, he dubbed it a New Deal with Africa. But behind the photo ops and fancy speeches, the old mindset still lingered, because when the summit ended, it became painfully clear nothing had really changed. Europe still saw Africa as a resource ground, a geopolitical chessboard, a place to keep Russia and China out rather than bring Africa in. They pledged 450 million vaccine doses by mid-2022. They announced a €150 billion Global Gateway Africa-Europe investment package, a package meant to support Africa's development and address vulnerable migration. It sounded impressive, bold, transformative, but here's the reality. Africa has yet to see any of it. No vaccines, no billions, no New Deal. Just more promises, just more delays, just more of the same. And that's why so many African leaders, from the streets of Bamako to the halls of Ouagadougou, are no longer waiting for Europe to deliver, because Africa has learned one hard truth. In this world, you don't rise by depending on others. You rise by standing on your own. And now, Africa is standing. In 2023, the President of the European Union arrived in Nairobi, Kenya, not for trade, not for diplomacy, but for the African Climate Summit, with a new message and an old agenda. They came bearing an offer, a proposal to tackle climate change together. But for many African leaders, that offer came with a bitter aftertaste, because for decades, Europe extracted, exploited, pillaged oil, gas, minerals, all torn from African soil to fuel Europe's industrial rise. Africa's riches built Europe's cities, powered its factories, lit its streets, and in doing so, helped heat the planet. Now, climate change has become a global crisis, but not a crisis born in Africa, because while Africa contributes less than 5% of global emissions, it suffers the most, with droughts, floods, crop failures, and rising heat scorching the very soil that Europe once profited from. But that's not the point. The point is this: Europe and the West had their chance. They used Africa's resources to become what they are today: developed, industrialized, powerful. And now, just as Africa prepares to use its own resources to build, to grow, to rise, the rules change. Now they say it's time for a green transition. Now they say fossil fuels must stay in the ground. Now they say Africa must not industrialize the same way they did. Isn't that convenient? Isn't that biased? Because if Europe could burn coal and pump oil to build empires, but Africa is told it must rely on solar panels and borrowed wind, then what kind of justice is that? What kind of partnership asks one side to sacrifice its future? To fix a past it didn't even cause? Africa is not the villain in this story. It's the victim, now trying to become the author of a new chapter. And this time, Africa won't ask for permission. Yes, it's true. There are still a few weak and greedy leaders on the continent, but something is shifting. A new generation of African leadership is rising. Leaders from Namibia, Botswana, Tanzania, and of course, the trailblazers of the AES bloc. They're proving that African leaders can be strong, patriotic, unapologetically African. They're not just reacting anymore, they're demanding, and they know what's at stake. They understand climate change intimately, because it's their people who are suffering the most from a crisis they didn't cause. So yes, they agree. A green energy transition is necessary. But here's the truth: you can't transition from nothing. How do you go green when your economies haven't even been allowed to industrialize? When the factories were never built, when your resources were taken, but your infrastructure was left behind. And now, Europe returns, this time not for gold or oil, but for lithium, cobalt, rare earth minerals, the very elements that will fuel Europe's next industrial revolution. You see, Africa holds the key to the green future the world wants. It has the minerals, the manpower, the potential, and now, Europe wants to be Africa's first partner in this new transition. But ask yourself, what does that really mean? Because the last time Europe was Africa's first partner, it led to centuries of extraction, exploitation, and inequality. This new green promise, it smells familiar. It's not just about saving the planet. It's about positioning Europe for dominance in the next global economy. Once again, Africa is being approached, not as a partner, but as a prize. And if African leaders aren't vigilant, this green revolution could become just another chapter in the same old story. But maybe, just maybe, this time, Africa will write the ending. And that's exactly why African leaders must tread carefully. Now that Africa is back at the center of global attention, now that its resources, its youth, and its future are seen as vital to the world, it's time to negotiate from a place of power. No more lopsided deals, no more empty promises, no more partnerships that benefit everyone except Africa, because Africa is rising. And with that rise comes an opportunity, perhaps the greatest in modern history, to shape the continent's future on its own terms, but only if its leaders have the courage to say no to exploitation and yes to dignity, equality, and sovereignty. This moment isn't just about climate or energy or diplomacy. It's about legacy. And the question now is, will Africa claim what is rightfully hers? What are your thoughts? Do you believe Africa is finally in a position to lead, not follow? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and most importantly, subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Africa is writing its story. Be part of it.